All right, so at the bottom of my screen here, I have three words written out, those being Odyssean, Heraclean, and Orphic. Now, these are all adjectives that are used to describe things, actions, or people that are reminiscent of a certain Greek figure. So from left to right, obviously, it's Odysseus, Heracles, and then Orpheus. Now, there's one thing that unites all of these three, and it might not jump out to you at first, but in my mind, these are the three canonical Greek figures to successfully complete a catabasis, or a ritual journey into the Greek afterlife. You could say that Theseus belongs here, as technically he goes down to the afterlife, but I would disagree with you because at the end of the day, Heracles is actually the one who saves Theseus from the afterlife. Otherwise, he would have just been stuck there forever. So these are the three guys who do it on their own. My sort of follow-up question is, which one of these figures sticks out like a sore thumb, right? Which one doesn't belong? Who's the oddball? And obviously that's Orpheus. So the first two are some of the most renowned and sort of prized heroes in Greek mythology, and then you have Orpheus, who is sort of the black sheep of this triumvirate here. Now, Orpheus is often seen as a tragic figure. He's seen as a figure who ultimately fails and commits the cardinal mistake, which we'll get to. But that never really sat right with me, right? How do you have it that these three mortals complete what is essentially the most triumphant task in all of Greek mythology, which is to cross the threshold into the afterlife and return alive? How is it that three of them do it, but only two of them are seen as heroes? So today I want to go through and read a book from Ovid's Metamorphoses. It's just really a page and a half or 2 pages long here on this excerpt. And hopefully by the end of it, we'll be able to do two things. One, I want to argue that Orpheus is a hero, and that Orpheus actually succeeds in his mission. And the second is to answer the question, what are we, the reader, supposed to take away from this story? Many Greek myths have a really clear sort of moral to them that we're supposed to take away at the end. And you might say, well, the takeaway of Orpheus is to have trust, or to not be unfaithful, or not to be too eager. And I think those are all incredibly shallow tastes for such a beautiful story. So hopefully we can come to something a little bit more interesting by the time that we read this. So the first paragraph here, we learn a little bit about Orpheus and Eurydice. Orpheus is a poet, and he marries Eurydice, and she's out playing in the field with some naiads, and she gets bitten by a snake and she dies. It's quite sudden. Happens in a couple sentences. Orpheus is obviously really distraught by this, and we arrive at one of many really key word choices employed by Ovid here. That's the word dare. So Ovid here, in saying that he dared to go down to Styx, Ovid acknowledges that the journey to the afterlife is daring. And you might say, well, of course it's daring. Everyone knows it's daring. And that's actually not true. So in an earlier version of the Orpheus myth, which is told by Plato, Plato actually sort of spends the entire time portraying Orpheus as a coward. Now, Plato's understanding is that if Orpheus really cared about Eurydice, that he would have just killed himself and joined her in the afterlife, sort of like Romeo and Juliet. And Plato views Orpheus's descent into the afterlife as an act of cowardice, because at the end of the day, he's clinging onto his mortality. And Ovid really usurps both of those notions by the end of this, but you can see that from the very origins of the Orpheus myth, there's this idea that he is a coward, or he's a loser of some sorts. So Ovid is really, in my opinion, the one who pioneers Orpheus as having heroic qualities. So again, he dares to go down. And this last sentence at the bottom of the first paragraph really is going to hold a lot of things together. So this is where Ovid tells us expressly why Orpheus is going to the underworld. Now, you might think that Orpheus's ultimate goal is to revive his wife, to revive Eurydice and bring her back to the land of the living. And you can certainly argue that. I'm not necessarily going to argue against that. But in writing here, Ovid says that Orpheus is going down to the underworld to see if he might not move the dead. And so this is really important, because if we understand what the parameters of success are, then we can understand what the parameters of failure are. So whether or not Orpheus succeeds on this daring journey will be determined on whether or not he can move the dead. And this is not a physical moving, so he's not talking about moving the dead around physically, or moving Eurydice from the land of the dead to the land of the living. He's talking about stirring the dead, stirring something emotional in the dead, which we'll get to. This next paragraph, he is sort of in the afterlife here, and he's talking and sort of orating to Hades and Persephone. And I want to point out this really beautiful word pairing here that we won't really know what to do with now until we get to the end of the story. But Ovid describes the afterlife as a quote-unquote joyless kingdom. And you might say, well, of course the afterlife is joyless, it's the land of the dead. And sure, that's true. But again, I think once we come to understand the rest of the story, we can come back to this beautiful phrase here, and it's really going to tell us ultimately what we're supposed to take away from this entire story. So just let the word sit at the sort of back of your head for now. He comes down, and here he references some of his predecessors. He says, I've not come here to see Tartarus nor divine server, so obviously referencing Heracles here. He says the wife is the cause of my journey. So again, we have a second motivation here, right? He wants to move the dead, and he was sort of galvanized to do that because of his wife. So all in all, Orpheus will be successful if he is able to essentially convey the same emotions of love that he feels towards his wife, if he can place those emotions in the inhabitants of the afterlife. So that's what we're looking out for. Can he do that? So he goes on this long rant here, and at the end he says, I'm determined not to return. You can delight in both of our deaths if the fates refuse what he's asking for. And so this is another moment where we really see differences in Ovid and Plato. Because again, Plato saw that this descent, or this catabasis, was an act of cowardice, because it means that Orpheus was clinging too firmly to his own mortality. And Ovid very explicitly says here that Orpheus never really had the intent to necessarily stay alive without Eurydice. And this is my favorite paragraph in the whole story here, arguably in all of Ovid's Metamorphoses. But as Orpheus is telling the story of his wife, Ovid enumerates all of the figures in the afterlife which are moved by his speech. So the bloodless spirits wept as he spoke. This is not really this is not any specific spirit in Greek mythology, but understand that blood is a signifier of mortality. So the bloodless spirits are those who are immortal, right? He's able to cause this emotional shift in the immortal, and it goes up one level after that. He's actually able to cause an emotional shift in the Furies, which are, the deities of vengeance and fate. So he is able to make the Furies cry for the first time in Greek mythology, to my knowledge. And it goes one level above that. He actually is so convincing that the king of the deep and his royal bride, as it says here, Hades and Persephone themselves, couldn't say no to him. So at the end of this paragraph, we haven't even gotten to the part with Eurydice yet. By his own metrics, Orpheus has already succeeded. He's done what no one else has ever been able to do before, which is he goes down into the underworld and he brings all of these immortal spirits and figures to tears. So in some senses, this is his Odyssean task. This is his Heraclean task, and this is one of the ways we can reinterpret what it means to be Orphic, right? So being Orphic is not necessarily failing. It is having this immense emotional intelligence or this immense emotional prowess. And I would argue that doing something like causing the Furies to cry out of sympathy for you is immensely more impressive than restraining Cerberus with your bare hands, right? So obviously they agree, and they let him see his wife again, and they say, you can actually even take her out of here. The one condition being he must not turn his eyes behind him. And this is, we all know where it goes from here. So he's walking out, and he turns around to see her. Why does he turn around to see her? That's a critical question. Why does Orpheus turn around? This is probably the most important part that varies based on who tells you this story. And this is why I love the way that Ovid tells the story. Now, Ovid doesn't pretend that Orpheus is perfect. So there are parts of the sentence that show you that Orpheus lacks sort of that resolve that we might associate with Odysseus or Heracles. But he possesses something else that the others don't. So Ovid says, afraid she was no longer there and eager to see her, the lover turned his eyes. But again, even though Orpheus is not Hercules or Heracles, and he's not Odysseus, he is heroic in his own right. He is noteworthy in his own right. And we see this, again, in the paragraph I just went over. And that's why Ovid actually doesn't describe him as a hero. He describes him as a lover. And that's really, really important here, that the chief word that Ovid wants us to associate with Orpheus is that he's a lover. And so, one of the theses that come out of the sentence is that being a lover is distinct from being a hero from Greek mythology, right? To be a hero, you are in many ways sort of like this perfect figure. But to be a lover means you have flaws. But beside your flaws, and most importantly, you have passion. And that's what we see here. He was afraid that she was no longer there and eager to see her. And that's why he turns around, because ultimately Orpheus is a lover. And I want to make a sort of outlandish point here, which is that this sentence actually elucidates a metaphorical level to this entire story. So obviously, when we hear the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, we think about a man who is literally trying to revive his wife from the dead. And you can absolutely read it that way. The way that I read it, through the lens of this one sentence, is that the whole thing is a metaphor for memory. If we read the sentence, this is actually exactly what it is to remember someone. Afraid that they're not longer, that they're no longer there, that you don't, that you're forgetting them, and you want to see them again. You want to experience something again. That's what the core of memory is. And there's even this imagery of turning the eyes inward or turning the eyes behind, which historically is very associated with memory or the dream state. So that's just something I'm going to leave on the table. I won't really make a whole dissertation about this being an allegory for human memory. But memory is absolutely a key theme here, right? You are eager to see her again, and that is what causes him to turn around. So he turns around, and obviously he fails Hades' test, and she falls, right? But in those last moments that we have with Eurydice, Ovid gives us some really important things. First of all, she says farewell to him. Now, this is incredibly significant because if you go back to the start where Eurydice dies, as I said before, it's incredibly sudden, and there's no sense of closure. There's no catharsis. The catharsis comes when she dies a second time. That's when she says farewell to him. And this is really important because there must have been something this time that closes out the arc of Eurydice. There's something that happens that completes her character and that gives her the ability to say this farewell in the story. So what is that? Well, let's go to the sentence before. Dying a second time now, there was no complaint to her husband. What then could she complain of except that she had been loved? So you might think that, if you were being rescued from the afterlife and you wanted to get out of there and your partner botched the job and looked at you at the last second, you'd probably be pretty mad, right? Because you were just a step or two away from getting your life back, and then they messed up. And that's what the classical reading of Orpheus has you believe. Ovid's reading here says that Orpheus's look, his glance, the quote-unquote fatal glance, is actually an act of love. It's not an act of immaturity or disbelief or unfaithfulness. It's an act of love. And Eurydice understands this entirely. And she says, she says farewell because she understands for the most final time that she's loved by Orpheus. And there's this really beautiful image where, when Orpheus turns around, everyone attributes that moment to his ultimate failure. But Eurydice, critically, as Ovid writes it, she turns around as well, right? So when he turns around and they face each other and he sees her for the last time, he activates that memory of her. He immortalizes her in a different way. She says farewell to him. She gets to say her goodbye. She understands that she loves him. And then she mirrors him. She turns around as well. So there's this beautiful interplay between the two. And the last moment that they have with each other is not confrontational. It's a moment of acceptance where they both get this beautifully cathartic ending. So in turning away, she sort of reinterprets this turn that has come to be incredibly misconstrued in popular culture. So really the turn that we should be paying attention to is Eurydice's turn, because her turn is a turn which signals her understanding of love. So there's a lot on the table here, but before this gets too long, I just want to answer that final question, which is, what are we supposed to take away from the story? So I've already argued that Orpheus is in many rights his own version of a hero, and that he's not a failure, and he's arguably not even tragic. He's a lover, right? But what are we supposed to get from this as the reader? This is where we can go back to this phrase from earlier, the joyless kingdom. So Ovid describes the afterlife as a joyless kingdom, and again, Orpheus's main act of heroism is being able to go in this joyless kingdom and bring them a sense of joy. You might not describe it as joy at first, but when you look at this paragraph here and you see all these immortal spirits that are weeping and crying and getting emotional over the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, they are crying because they feel, arguably for the first time, what it means to love someone, and what it means to love someone so violently that you would go to the ends of the earth to see them one more time. And that is something that is completely foreign to them. So you could say that Orpheus's ultimate act of heroism is coming down to the land of the immortals and showing them that there is beauty in mortality. And one step further, we could summatively say that the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, the myth of Orpheus's Catharsis, teaches us that there is immense beauty in our own mortality. There is a necessity in things that pass. There is a value in things that are only temporary. And if we did not have things that were ephemeral, things that were fleeting, if by some miracle in this life we could cling on to things forever and nothing ever left us, that would be, in Ovid's own words, a joyless kingdom. It would be a powerful existence where we had dominion over everything, where we never had to lose anything in our lives. We never had to lose anyone we loved, any of the places that we cherished. That might sound good at first, but that sort of immortality is unnatural. And as Ovid argues, it is a joyless kingdom. It is having everything and nothing at once. When we have things that leave us, when we lose people in our lives, Orpheus tells us that the memory of them is what matters. And as long as we have the ability to remember them, as long as, as he says, as long as we can feel their absence in our lives, as long as we still feel the emotion of eagerness to see them and to remember them, and as long as we have the capacity to remember things and people that are no longer with us, that is the ultimate form of immortality that we should chase in this life. So hopefully, with all that in mind, you can see Orpheus from a slightly different dimension, and you can see that Orpheus, there is something absolutely heroic about him. And even though his story is sad, in the way that losing anything is sad, he's able to teach the underworld and hopefully teach the reader a lesson as well. And that is teaching us a lesson in the beauty and the necessity of impermanence.